NYSSBA News is supported by the New York School's Insurance Reciprocal.
Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of NYSSBA Newsmakers with me, Tim Kremer, the Executive Director of the New York State School Boards Association. My guest today is Jim Malatras, President of the Rockefeller Institute for Government. Jim is here to discuss what the Institute does related to education, its role in research projects, and how the research is used. Prior to arriving at the Institute, Jim held several high-ranking positions in New York State government. Most recently, he served as Director of State Operations to Governor Andrew Cuomo, where he managed the day-to-day operations of state government and served as the administration's point person on policy. Jim received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in political science from the University at Albany. Jim, tell me a little bit about the Rockefeller Institute. What is this institute?
The Rockefeller Institute was something created about 40 years ago of former Rockefeller employees when he was the governor. And what they wanted to do was provide nonpartisan, evidence-based public policy research for policymakers, not even just in New York State, but across the nation. And they focused on a couple of different areas: fiscal policy, healthcare policy, education policy, and something called federalism, which is just a complicated way of saying the interaction between state, federal, and local governments. So from there, it has grown and grown and grown into what it is today, which is a pretty vibrant, nonpartisan public policy research institute that is situated within the SUNY System. We are the SUNY System's think tank. We're the research arm of the SUNY think tank, the SUNY System.
Sounds like the perfect fit for you.
Yeah.
Given your background and all the different positions that you've held, you're just like, this is just perfect for you. You're probably having a ball.
It's more fun than I could even imagined, and we're doing some really interesting things. So I love going to work every day.
So in general, you have research that is something that is people conduct within the Institute, or you have people who do this outside the Institute but publish through the Institute? How's this work?
So as the research arm for the SUNY System, we have a core group of staff and researchers that work for the Rockefeller Institute.
Okay.
But we also serve as the network for the SUNY System. So researchers all throughout the system, Stony Brook, Buffalo, Albany, they may have ideas, and we team up with them on cutting edge things that they might want to do, or what policymakers are asking us to look into. So if there's an energy question, for instance, we'll team up with some folks at some schools at like Stony Brook, per se, and then we'll work together and put out a report. Or if it's a fiscal, we might work with the folks at the University of Albany's business school and then put out a report. So we serve as sort of the hub for the spokes of the SUNY System to serve all of the researchers in the system for policymakers in New York.
So if the report's put out, does it indicate it's published by the Rockefeller Institute?
Yes. And if we're doing it in conjunction with somebody, one of the university systems or another organization, sometimes we jointly do things all the time, but we often publish it as the Rockefeller
And you
Institute.
mentioned it's done nationally, so
Yeah.
you'll actually have some researchers from outside the SUNY system work with you as well?
Yes, we're doing this, we're actually doing analysis for the SMART Commission, which is looking at private sector pensions. And what we did is our researchers in-house have worked with Boston College researchers and others. So yeah, we cast a wide net. We go to where the expertise is to try to get the best thinking available. We're not just invested in our own thinking. We want to get the best thinking that's out there.
I've noticed you guys have done a lot of stuff with pensions, simulation projects and things of that nature that kind of determine to what extent is this a viable pension fund? Is it going to be able to pay off its liabilities in the long term? I know that you've done one recently with Michigan.
Yes, Michigan's they're closing one of their pension systems and moving to change their pension structure. But we've looked at Los Angeles and a bunch of pension systems, and we go with just the facts, ma'am. Right? We just go where the facts are. And Don Boyd, who is heading up this project, one of our
former school board member.
Yeah. He came up with a pension simulation model, which is internationally known now, which does look at the relative health of pension funds, because people assume their pension fund is fine, we're going to grow at this rate, and lo and behold, 10, 20, 30 years later, they're not solvent anymore, and they're looking at those problems. So what Don is going in and looking at is, where are the problems now? Are you on the right course? Are you using the right variables to make sure that you have a solvent long-term pension fund? Sometimes not the sexiest thing to talk about, but boy, it has a long-lasting impact for taxpayers as well as those people receiving the benefits of the pension, because most public pension systems, someone's going to pay to make up those costs. So it's a very complex issue, not a sexy issue, but boy, it has a real lasting effect on people, taxpayers, and the beneficiaries too.
Now, here in the state of New York, these public pensions are constitutionally guaranteed. Is that true in all states?
Not all states. But many states have protections for those pensioners, especially in the public systems, that you have to make up those costs somehow. But there are different rules. New York has a very strong constitutional provision. Not all states have that provision.
I know that that's been something that people are looking at very carefully because, I'm hearkening back to Detroit,
Right.
saying we need to get out from and restructure our debt, declared bankruptcy, and we need to restructure this. And if I'm correct, some of those pensioners did not get their full pension.
That's correct. That is correct. And some people don't even realize that's a possibility. In the private sector, they understand that more. But in the public sector, they don't realize that sometimes that one day, all of that nest egg that you think you've accumulated over those years is gone instantaneously.
Yeah.
Every administration that comes in has a different version of their vision of government, right? We call it federalism, but really it's how does the federal government interact with state governments,
Right.
fiscally and otherwise. And President Bush, George W. Bush had a very different version of federal policy reach than President Obama did, than President Trump did. And that all has effects and outcomes, and how do states deal with those policy questions. This is a new administration. We're 150 days into it now. And there's a lot of things going on even in those 150 days, so there's a lot of things to look at.
So an idea comes forward. Somebody says, I would like to do some research. And how, if I was interested, how would I get something initiated at the Rockefeller Institute, and who would approve that plan?
So people come to our website quite often. They look for we have a lot of reports going back 30, 40 years. We keep a lot of them online so people can have access to them. People reach out directly to us. We'll have a policymaker come to us, or the school boards would come and call and say, by the way, we have this question. And if we have the expertise, we often do provide the analysis. We come up with some arrangement and we do it. So that's often the case. And we have a very robust approval process because we want to make sure that we have the expertise and we're not just giving you something. We want to give high quality. What Rockefeller is known for is gold standard quality research. People don't really question what comes out of our shop.
Right.
And it goes through Tom Gaze, who is the head of he's the director of research. He's been there for a long time.
Right.
He served under Dick Nathan, my predecessor. He has a whole approval process with his researchers, and it eventually comes to me for final approval. And then we even work with SUNY Central Administration to ensure that, what are we doing? Do you think what we're doing here is okay? Would you look at it differently too? So it goes up a chain, and then even outside of our organization into SUNY administration to make sure that what we're doing, we have the expertise and we're really following through on what we were saying our research design and everything is.
So can I assume that somebody who wants to do something, I'll say commission a project, they're going to have to pay for that?
Oh, totally, yeah. I mean, the pension project started off as a commission project, but what we try to do is, what we do all the time is we wall off. Everybody has an angle or an interest.
Now, can I assume, though, that an organization, let's say like mine, we're nonpartisan as well, but there might be organizations out there that are not so nonpartisan,
Right.
That are partisan, in fact, who might commission research with you with the idea that we're going to get information that we're going to use for advocacy or for political purposes.
And what we're always clear about, though, up front is, once we come up with the arrangement, we wall it off. Mm-hmm. And what it is what it is. And sometimes
these are the facts.
We've had people say, well, we can't use this. Well, that's wasn't the question that you asked us. Right. What is the answer that is what you wanted? Right. We gave you the answer.
Right.
Sorry, can't use it.
Yeah.
But that's part of the process. I mean, we're proud of that expertise.
You need to maintain a level of objectivity, or it isn't going to do us any good.
Well, you're seeing in this day and age, without objective fact-based organizations, it only just becomes a political fight. And if you're looking at the healthcare debate right now, the fact that people are trying to destabilize the CBO even, which has had a long historical nonpartisan approach to providing fiscal analysis for bills emerging out of Congress, then really all it is a political fight. You say one thing, I say the other thing, and the public suffers as a result. We want to provide information to the public and to policymakers. They have their own political identification. They use it how they want. But that is an important step in the governmental policymaking process.
Can you point to something where you say, here's something that we did the research, and it really did drive a social change, a change of direction, and an improvement in society today.
I have seen now our fiscal policy, how federal budgets affect state and local budget making, and the forecasting on that has driven real change in different states. Not even like New York. I'm talking Michigan and Montana and other states across the nation. On the health side, for instance, our health experts, Erica Martin's one of our health experts, is known for open data. And how do you get access to good data to use
what's
in the
open data?
Open data is putting out as much governmental source material as possible so people can see how decisions are being made, what are the facts, so they can address issues or not, right?
Yeah.
Your organization can look at it, our organization can
Right.
look at it. That helps drive change. That process has really worked in providing more information through the Department of Health, for instance. So there is an issue that we've been working on that has driven a change in the public sector. And that what we're excited about on the opioids, which you mentioned, we put out a report. The report was shocking to us in many ways.
Oh, yeah.
That the problem is actually is growing at a greater speed upstate and in the suburbs, not in New York City. People automatically assume New York City, it must be there. This is a suburban upstate problem, which then has a very different set of ways of maybe dealing with or addressing the situation. So now we're excited to see how that report becomes policy making and how we can help change policies based on the evidence that we found. So that's a work in progress, but we're very excited about the prospect.
I was at a conference not long ago where that issue of opioid epidemic came up, and it was the speakers were a group of cops from Rutland, Vermont.
Yeah.
And how they had changed completely the way they went about addressing this issue from treating it as a criminal sort of thing to a health issue, and the way that they behaved differently and the impact it was having. And it was all done within the context, interestingly enough, of a workers' compensation discussion, which was like, what? But as it turns out, as long as you have these drugs in place, there are dangerous people that are attracted to that. Those dangers bring the cops, and the cops are now in an environment that could result more likely in a workers' compensation claim. So they're handling things differently in a way that is actually addressing workers' comp to some extent, but having a very positive impact on the way they treat these people who have this problem.
This is the proud thing about Rockefeller. Sometimes you do things, you present facts that a policymaker or a law enforcement official may never even want to think about.
Right.
McDowell County, West Virginia is the epicenter of the opioid crisis in the country. It has the highest rate of death in the nation.
Wow.
McDowell County, West Virginia. So you look at what they do, and some of the things they've done, like other communities, upstate, rural communities have done, largely white communities. For years, syringe programs, trading syringes, giving syringes, was for transmission of diseases. They said, well, if you do that, it helps lower the disease transmission like AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and things like that. They also found data that this might work in drugs, with drug addiction and opioid addiction too. If you give them access that wean folks off, you can try to address the solution. Rejected in those communities for years because it didn't sound right to them, right? Well, you can't give people syringes because that's going to kind of incentivize people to use drugs. What they're finding in those communities, because necessity is the mother of invention. You come up with a bad problem. You have a bad problem. You need to come up with some interesting solutions. Those programs are working to lower the overall opioid and drug addiction rate in those communities. It's having the opposite effect of what they thought it was. And they're going to those places where they never were. But that was all based on evidence, reports, statistics saying, listen, these are the problems. You need to do something bolder, different than you've been doing. So they're going there. So I think you'll see some of those very same things. Well, what do you mean a workers' comp issue? We never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
We never thought about doing an issue that way. I think reports and organizations like us, we help drive those things.
Now, you've been looking at the Affordable Care Act that is in place, that came through with the Obama administration. Now we have the
American Health Care Act.
The American Health Care Act that the Trump administration is attempting to put forward to replace the Affordable Care Act. What are we learning about these changes and the potential differences between the two?
This is what hopefully where Rockefeller Institute of Government fills a space. In the political fight, right, often it is Obamacare is either good or bad, and Trump care is either good or bad, and you each stand on your sides and you fight it out.
Right.
We've been looking at the Affordable Care Act, which is Obamacare now since it's been implemented. And some states have done it really well, and some states haven't done it as well, and there have been problems emerging. You have to address problems. It's not like or dislike. For instance, in the marketplace, in the exchanges in Obamacare, we're finding that when there is reduced competition, rates go way up, which makes it almost cost prohibitive for people anyway. So you're seeing some pockets of the state, especially of the country, rural parts of our country, where people aren't getting access to healthcare, even though they're supposed to have access to healthcare. And how do you fix that, right? There's one part. So it's not Obamacare versus Trump care. It is, well, there's issues there too. Now you throw this American Health Care Act piece over it, and it becomes even more complicated of an analysis because they sort of introduced this element of Medicaid changes, which are dramatic.
Cuts.
They're reductions.
Reductions.
And then in
okay.
New York State, they've done this extra step of saying, well, we're going to also do this shift too.
Yeah.
And what does that mean to the community? So it's an enormously complex issue. And where we sort of stepped in, I stepped in one part was, at one point, the Congress, the House passed the American Health Care Act without a CBO scoring analysis, objective organizational analysis of this is what it costs and this is who loses their health insurance. We think that's a mistake. We like to give as much information before you take actions, right? And we want people to have that information. So we're working with organizations across the nation and other partners from University of Pennsylvania, across the board. Brookings, we've been working with Brookings organization to put out reports and facts about what's going on so people can make a decision, or policymakers at least have the facts before they're out there.
Do you think our congressional delegation in Washington is reading your stuff?
Well, I don't think there was no stuff to be read, and sadly, before the vote was had, right? We couldn't even get to the analysis.
Right.
But hopefully now that there's a process in place, the Senate's now looking at it, more information will go out.
Yeah.
I think even lawmakers were surprised about the effect of some of the changes under Trump care. And I think even on the Democratic side, people are recognizing that there are issues with Obamacare.
Right.
The problem becomes, how do you bridge those divides and fix something or change something that of a product that some people want? Because I think what people are finding is people do like having access to health care.
Yep.
The one thing that Obamacare has solidified was, 24 million Americans do like getting that access. It's how do you protect that access, protect the taxpayers, and do something rationally.
Make it available at an affordable rate.
Correct.
I'm sure it's, the small employers that are saying, I can't afford to do all these things that you're obligating me to do, even if they feel as if it's important for them to have it in place.
We did an event with with all the stakeholders. We had the Business Council there. Even the Business Council, the business community was surprising in their approach, right? This is why you ask people, and this is why you provide objective analysis. They don't like some of the provisions of Obamacare, but they rather have certainty as opposed to uncertainty, because they don't know how to deal with uncertainty. Uncertainty
It's
actually
like the stock market.
drives more costs. So they're saying to us, they were saying, okay, keep it as it is. At least we can understand that and deal with it. We don't understand this chaos in the current system. It's interesting when you talk to folks how their perspectives are when you assume, they would be for repealing the Affordable Care Act. They actually were much more
That was the big
uncertain.
wake-up calls, repeal and replace, but the replace was not clearly understood. One thing that just came out is the fact that the Trump administration wants to retreat from the Paris Climate Accord. And Governor Cuomo and the governor from California and the governor from Washington have developed a pact. They said, we're not going to let that happen in our state. We're going to live up to the Accord's agreement. How do you feel about that?
I wrote an interesting piece, and there's something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is 9 Northeast states that have banded together to basically do cap and trade. We pay for our pollution as a way to reduce our carbon footprint and invest in renewable energy. I said the Rockefeller Institute, we said that's a great model for other states to use. And we wrote that when the Trump administration pulled out of the Clean Power Plant Regulations Act, which is something different. I think what you're seeing is, we said, well, states can band together as a model. And what you're seeing now with the Paris Agreement, with the U.S. government pulling out of that, states are moving to more collaborative state models. What I think is interesting and what we're looking at now, if you put everybody in higher education together, there's 20 million students and about 4 million employees. That's 24 million people in higher education. If you treated them as a state, higher education would be the third largest state in the nation. They spend $14 billion a year on energy costs. Well, what if you did a consortium idea like RGGI, like the 9 Northeast states do, treat yourself like a state. And all the higher education institutions will come together and say, here's our common goals, here's how we're going to lower carbon emissions to protect our atmosphere and our air. The federal government's withdrawn. Now you have a big system like higher education. It's not a government. It's a category. It's a subject matter area of people.
Right.
That could drive change. So I think what you're going to see is we're going to do all sorts of analysis is, okay, if the U.S. pulls out, now what do you do if you want to respond to the global climate crisis, which is in some people's mind? I don't think I'm an evidence-based person. There's enough evidence to suggest that climate change is a real thing. It's man-made.
So. Yeah.
And how do you then go about addressing those things? So I think there's all sorts of very interesting models. I love to see higher education get into that space, other states, but you're seeing those things play out right now.
Another thing that I know that your organization has written some information about recently was the potential Supreme Court case that might deem agency shop fees that unions collect as being unconstitutional. And here in New York, it would appear that the unions are attempting to kind of inoculate themselves from that. What do you know about that?
What we're finding, what would be the impact of this decision? So the new Supreme Court justice was just appointed. We think he's going to go with the majority. Gorsuch. He's going to go with saying you can't mandate union fees or dues if you don't want to opt into the system. In New York State, we said, what does that mean if that does happen? A potential of impact, they collect about $500 million a year in union fees.
Right.
And we've looked at different historical situations from the teachers union in the early 80s and the TWU, which is the transit workers for the MTA, when they lost their rights to collect dues automatically, and there was a real impact.
I read some things that happened in the past I did not know about.
Millions of dollars of losses and members lost. And then how does that affect policymaking in New York State and how that balance of power in Albany? We don't opine on whether that's right or wrong. Now, people have come out using our evidence on some side saying, yeah, we should have the right to opt in or opt out. You shouldn't tell us what we have to do. Others say, no, we have a strong union movement in the state. We just put out the analysis, which was really interesting. I don't think people fully understood how dramatic a decision like that could actually be. And it would be, I think, dramatic.
I read in there, the union collects dues, and typically the dues go to run the operations of the union.
Right.
But what they use for political purposes, lobbying, is usually comes from a PAC.
Outside. Right.
Okay. But they collect these dues, it goes to operations. Operations could include representation, say at the bargaining table, having field consultants out there, doing a variety of things. It's pretty broadly defined as to what operations are.
Yes, it's a really broad definition.
Okay. Constitutional Convention. Every 20 years, the state of New York has an opportunity to have a constitutional convention. And the people have to vote on whether or not they want one. And that vote takes place this year.
Right.
And then the Constitutional Convention would take place in a year or two.
Correct.
Okay. And I've only been in the state 19 years, so I'm kind of new at this. But as I understand it, there was one in 97, one in...
They pushed for a vote in 2007 early, which didn't happen.
But I also, in my reading, was finding that there really has not been any amendment that has been made to the Constitution that has stuck, if you will, since 1937.
From a Constitutional Convention point, yes.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We're one of a handful of states that allows this option to really give people a chance potentially at self-governing. How do you want to change your constitution?
Right.
Our constitution came before the federal constitution, the initial one.
And it's really big.
It's really long, and there's a lot of changes that have been made. I mean, in the 30s, we had the budgetary changes, which gave basically the executive a lot of authorities, an executive-led budget. We've had many constitutional amendments on protecting the environment, to housing, to social welfare. What Rockefeller does is we put it all out there, and it's complex. It's really complex.
Yeah.
How you select the delegates, if you were to hold one, 3 people in each Senate district and at large, and how do you get on the ballot, is an enormously complex area of analysis. Even people who like the Constitutional Convention idea say, well, we have to fix this thing. And then what we do is, at Rockefeller, we do 2 things at Rockefeller. We give a chance for all the sides to be heard. We have people who are pro-constitutional convention. We have people who say, we're a little suspicious of the Constitutional Convention. We have other people saying, you know what? We have a lot of rights in our Constitution. We don't want to take a chance.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. What is the risk of having a constitutional convention? Why would somebody object to it?
Opponents have said, it's interesting, that you don't want to lose the rights that we have. You have the right to free common education in our Constitution. You have the right to health care. You have the right to housing and social welfare in our Constitution. We have a right to pensions in our Constitution. That could all get reversed, especially in the current political environment. And they raise some of the issues. How you select the delegates is problematic.
I've heard that.
They're selected by Senate district, and that drives a certain outcome. And if you do it that way, so that's been some of the argument. The opponents have made the argument, the burden of proof is on the people who want it. And you haven't made enough of a case about why you want to do this. We have people on the other side that have recently opined on our Rockefeller blog. Ethics is the question of the day.
Yep.
You're not going to reform. You can't. No one reforms themselves, and that's in your industry. You have outside groups put together bylines and stuff because you don't do it. The financial industry has government to oversee it. People get regulated from outside groups. In government's a little different because lawmakers pass laws and the governor signs laws.
They govern themselves.
They govern themselves.
Yep.
And so the proponents have said, why we need a constitutional convention now more than ever is for strong ethics reform. They've used that as the impetus. But the opponents have said, well, you can't limit what is talked about in the constitutional convention, which is true.
I've heard somebody say to me that one of the things that they are concerned about is big money will come in and they will drive the agenda. What would big money want?
Well, I think what the opponents are suggesting is it's going to be on the worker rights side. They think those interests are going to roll back pensions and workers' rights that we've had built into the Constitution. They're very
Triborough Amendment, Taylor Law,
the environmental
teacher tenure issues, a lot of that stuff.
The environmental communities raised the same thing on we have the Forever Wild clause, which is a very strong environmental clause. I don't think any state has an environmental clause like New York State. So they're worried about that.
Redefinition of a sound basic education.
Correct, yeah. So people
could easily come through, which
absolutely.
is constitutionally guaranteed. Right. How do you define that?
Free common schools for any school child, any child in the state. That's a pretty broad, strong provision. So yeah, people worry about those things. Yeah. But it's fascinating. We're putting out a lot of information on it, and we're going to start holding debates between opponents and proponents of the Constitutional Convention, because I think that helps drive the conversation when people are actually talking about it as sometimes writing long theses.
Jim, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. This has been great. Stay tuned to NYSSBA News to see positive stories occurring in school districts all around New York State and for new newsmaker segments. On behalf of my colleagues at NYSSBA, have a great day.